Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It's Sunday morning here in Minnesota. I want to first thank everybody for their support this last week. It was a tough week. My wife's fever has broken. She's feeling better. Her test was negative, but they told her to treat it like it was a positive because she had all the symptoms and because of her job environment working with the homeless people. And I gotta say, sometimes my tension and stress level is greatly heightened by the fact she's dealing with so many broken people that capitalism and greed and a broken system has produced. She sees all strata of race and religious experience and sexuality. They all come through there. Some are permanent. Some have a lot of mental illness that goes undiagnosed or untreated. Medications for the homeless are sporadic at best. The system is leaving too many broken people in between the cracks. And a lot of these people self-medicate. So drugs and alcohol are rampant in that community. So outside of the stress of COVID and communicating through these people, which it does, there's all the stressors that exist in a normal environment dealing with homeless people, of just people on the edge, people frustrated, people broken, people ready to cry, people ready to lash out at somebody. It's an exhausting, stressful place to be, and especially when you advocate for them and then they turn around and treat you like garbage, out of resentment, out of anger, out of frustration. Most will apologize. Most will realize you're trying to help. But there's still a lot more tough days and sad stories that she has to carry. And then she comes home and has to dump some of that on me sometimes, so I have to carry it. And my frustration ends up coming out in a lot of my political commentary, a lot of my social, this is not how it's supposed to be. A wealthy nation should take better care of its people. It's one of the great injustices, and the future will condemn us for it. How we've treated our homeless, how we've ignored the problems, how not everyone's meant to play Monopoly. And most of us, when we're 10, are convinced, I'm going to get the Park Place, maybe Boardwalk. Better watch out for me. I'm going to be somebody. And some of us get to Illinois and stall out. Some of us get to Connecticut Avenue. But that's the lucky ones. Pacific Avenue, Marvin Gardens, 90% of us ain't going to get anywhere near that. We'll get our $200 a week. We'll have our utilities come in. If we're lucky, we'll be able to keep a place on Connecticut. And for a large majority of the world's people, Baltic Avenue, Mediterranean Avenue, that's where most people's economic allowances are going to leave them. Scraping by, having some material ownership of a home or renting, but just getting by. However, there's another large percentage of people that don't even get to be on the game board. They've lost their chips. They got no money, they went bankrupt. Some of them don't even get on the board to begin with. Addiction, coming from the children's, not orphan system, but where they place kids in with families. There's a lot of adopted, unhappy kids in these foster homes that never get the chance to really develop. Some do. But addiction and alcohol, coupled with the pressure and the expectation and the stress that's placed on young kids today. The expectation is so lofty, so great. And I think the digital age, the social media age of instant gratification and all the likes and all the high they get from that makes the reality of the mundane world and keeping a job and doing your duty that much more difficult. And the pressure is so great that a lot of people end up feeling like they're failures by the time they're 25. And it's not fair, and it takes a pretty broad understanding of the human experience through century and millennia to recognize that weight isn't a weight you need to carry. You don't need to feel like I'm not a good Western capitalist American Christian. because that's not really what you are. You're a human earthling. You're as much Aborigine. You're as much Manchurian. You're as much Egyptian as you are American. Those things existed for millennia. America's been around for a couple hundred years. We're a scratch on the surface of time. We have no bearing. And sadly, most of the legacy that we are leaving behind at this point is one of great exploitation, one of global occupation and greed, the legacies of slavery and the legacies of the genocide of the Native Americans. It's going to be attached to our name throughout history. Well, we did baseball, and the Constitution was a nice idea, but even that it's funny who it protects and what freedoms it talks about, and a lot of the ideas are great, don't get me wrong, but it didn't take long for the system to corrupt and go beyond the grasp of the regulators and the powers that be in government. And it's on us as the citizens to demand representative taxation. And I think that's the problem so many Americans have with socialism, is we pay taxes now and we don't get a lot. We get, roads and bridges, a lot that are in poor repair. We do see some of the fruits of our taxes. We're not living in abject poverty. Well, some of us are. But we also see a lot of abandoned cities and abandoned industrial sites, abandoned iron belt. There's a lot of destitute, forgotten people in this whole system. It's creating this whole climate of depression, anxiety, detachment. Kids sit in front of their video game systems playing them 12 hours a day because they're saving planets. They're their heroes. In the real world, I don't know my purpose, my meaning. I look in the mirror, I don't know my own identity anymore. I haven't achieved or accomplished much physically. All my accomplishments are virtual, and it just leads to further feelings of insecurity and depression and lack of belonging. Kids, I know there's not a lot of kids who watch my program, but if those of you who have kids, encourage real life achievement, real life accomplishment. That's how we build antlers. And it's antlers that allow us to rut and find a mate and have confidence to be successful. Because confidence, love of self, in the long term, that's the most solid foundation you could build your life and experience upon. So again, thank you for all the support from my wife and everyone who reached out and messaged. I didn't respond to any of them. I'm just going to thank everybody simultaneously. Each one of you who shared something, thank you. I appreciate that you value this experience and my participation in your life, and I value you guys. I love all the feedback and the dialogue and the thought-provoking and even the disagreements. It's challenging, it's stimulating. I don't want to be right all the time, and you can't be. Prove to me I'm wrong, and I'll be happy to follow along. I want to always be able to readjust my beliefs and what I think is true, and evidence to the contrary I will accept. It's tough. It's tough, Kids just have such a jaded mentality today, and they're really cut from knowledge, and that lack of knowledge, that lack of place in the world, not only today but my place in the world via a few generations, the migration, that connection to this human condition, that 3 generations ago you had Europeans, you had Asians, you had Africans. That migration is very integral in understanding the broadness of my possible destiny. I don't have to be limited to the scope of my society. I've shared it before and I'll say it again. The opposite of the society you're born into is the reality of all things. And that broad reality of all things has allowances for any walk of life that you wish to be. And if you can walk strongly in yourself and love yourself and feel confident in this is my reality, this is how I feel I need to live my life, those pressures and expectations that life and monopoly puts on us can wash away. It can have less of a bearing on us. But even the strongest of us in the wrong setting can feel really out of place. I remember when I was driving Lyft for a while, I had this, I don't want to call him a Wall Street executive, but he was a high level stock and trade kind of fella. and his conversations were beyond my comprehension of finance. And I can understand some of the global maneuverings by looking at the lines on the map and understand some of the greater principles at play. But I certainly wasn't about to give stock tips to this guy, and nor did I even understand a lot of the principles he was dropping on me that were about how to make money. And I don't feel out of place or uncomfortable very often, but I'll tell you what, during this car ride that was some 30 minutes long, I got out and felt like, gee, if I made some of the wrong choices, I don't know nothing about a lot of that. But at the end of the day, my history, my reality dictates to me there's a whole lot more to life, love, and happiness than the pursuit of greed and economics. And my very neighbor across the street here, Main Street's right there on this little small town called Elgin. And across the street, these neighborhood kids, there's about 3 or 4 of them that live in this building. And they're probably 18, 20 years old in that range. And they had a Confederate flag hanging in their front window the last week. And I was going to take a picture of it, but my front windows were too dirty, so the picture didn't look any good. And then when I went outside to take a picture of it yesterday, it had been taken down. And whether someone had called them from the city complaining or whether just one of them came to their senses, I don't know. And I understand the history of the Confederate flag, and 30, 40, 50 years ago, it seemed almost like a lighthearted jab at Southern good old boys. But now it's become a symbol beyond just that history and beyond just the memories of the North versus the South. It now symbolizes the oppression of the black community. And in a sense, you're condoning and saying we understood and think that was fine because of it was our history, it was our tradition, it was our heritage. And if it's offensive to a large enough group, I think we need to be sensitive enough to understand we don't need to poke the beast. You're not trying to secede. So hanging that flag up, it's meant to be inflammatory. It's meant to be, you're taking a stand. And I think that's one of the great problems with society today, is that so much of our news cycle, it's meant to force us to choose one side or the other. Ain't no time for being in the center. Ain't no time for wishy-washy. We're going to provoke this point so strongly that you're going to be forced, hopefully via outrage, to follow one camp or the other. And here's a great example. Black versus blue lives. The cops versus the blacks. The blacks and the police, neither of them are saying you have to pick a side. You're either with them or you're with us. Not one cop I've ever spoken to had that feeling in their soul or when they spoke. And of course the black community is not saying you have to pick cops or pick us. It's the media, driven by those above who own the media, who want to create that narrative. So that the average Joe Blow who lives here in rural America and doesn't have much interaction with the police or the black community, they're going to feel so charged by what they see on the news every night. And police stations burning and the protests and riots and blacks shooting cops shooting blacks. They end up feeling like they got to pick a side here. And that's what the end result is. It polarizes people into camps. And there's a lot of people out here in rural America that have signs on their front lawn that say we support Blue Lives Matter. And you don't have to make that choice. You don't have to say, you know what, I'm pro-cop, anti-black. And no one's asking you to say, I'm pro-black, fuck the police. That's not the solution. That's not the way to create any kind of narrative that moves forward. It's meant to keep us stuck in this current quagmire that we're in. Polarized, divided, outraged. And it all comes back to my wife's job with the homeless people. A society that wants to be free and think of itself as cutting edge and a pinnacle of what society should look like shouldn't have people without health care and clean water. It shouldn't have millions of homeless people struggling to stay cool in the summer and warm in the winter. It shouldn't have an education system that's crumbling. But again, that broken education system is part of the plan. The capitalists have been writing those textbooks for a century now to create good little workers. Free thinkers are distracted. Get back in the factory. Get back in the office. No. No room for imagination. No room for the dream. Think small. Think, I need to get my paycheck. I have debt to pay, bills, responsibilities. And so it stifles the individual growth of the human and the experience that would be more satisfying and gratifying to most of us, and forces us into a life where hopefully I can stay here on Connecticut or Baltic Avenue. I got my little house I'm renting on the Monopoly board, and boy, it sure feels like I'm a worker on an anthill and I'm not happy. And happiness is the end game. It's the ultimate measuring stick of a person and a society. And the society we've bred, built on greed, and your hope of me being one of the rich someday makes you make allowances for everybody else who's taking a lot and not giving anything back. That greed, boy, it's just not going to play well in the long term. And it's going to leave us all very unhappy. And it's going to lead to very high crime rates. And it's going to lead to a very broken future. So let's move on to today's topic. So one of the things that I feel I want to comment on right now is I get a lot of flack from people for my critical commentary of the avant-garde at times, and even my opinions and observations of Miles Davis. People get offended or like have a hard time with it, and I'm not sure really why, because in what world would we think of Miles Davis as a good person? He's kind of an ass, just the way, you know, he handles his bands even and fires people. He's not. But that being aside, I find a great hypocrisy in the avant-garde community especially, because when they say to me, why you gotta be so critical, why you gotta be negative, why do you gotta talk down, why do you have to disparage, why do you have to say that's not jazz music? And almost without exception, these are the same people who try to discredit anything that's commercial jazz and anything that might have appeal to a broader audience. They don't hesitate to find some new jazz fan in their group and be like, oh, that's garbage. Why would you buy that? Jimmy Smith? Oh my God. And I'm going to not talk about a few artists right now that the avant-garde community feels free to disparage all the time. And one of the things they all kind of share in common is that they were successful. They were commercial. And it's a bit like that kid that only likes the abstract, different punk rock band that nobody else likes. And the second that it becomes popular, oh, that's garbage. And it makes some of the avant-garde people say look a little childish, honestly, because you're saying the very things to me that's not jazz about a lot of things that were very successful jazz. And jazz was always a successful music. It was always a popular music of the people. That's what it did, is it sold really well. It spoke to generations, 4 generations. And so your little abstract angled offshoot that I say that's not jazz, that's something new that's inspired from jazz and has its roots in jazz, but it's not just jazz, that's offensive to you. But you don't hesitate to take a guy like Dave Brubeck, who, going back to his Exit Fantasy in 53, 54, playing with Paul Desmond and playing with Cal Tjader and the Fantasy label on the West Coast, he's a great player. And he understood the blues better than most white cats do. He plays with stride, with groove, with rhythm, pulsations. He's not the most intricate player. He's not necessarily, and he was actually fairly intricate early on. He had an accident at some point where it changed some of how he had to play, but it actually led to that spatial playing that allows Paul Desmond to shine. And because it's commercial, and because it has appeal, and because you can play it and your girlfriend doesn't go, the avant-garde's like, oh, Brubeck ain't jazz. Not jazzy enough for me. And it's like, if it doesn't have horns honking, overblowing, they think it's not jazz. And overblowing doesn't take skill. Overblowing on a horn is not an indication of ability. Anybody can pick up a saxophone and overblow on it and make it wah. Playing pattern repetitiously with groove and melody and allowing a horn player to intricately weave through what you're laying down, that's jazz. So Brubeck's one of the first guys that this community feels like they can attack with impunity, but don't you dare attack the music we love. Cal Tjader, he's another guy. And Tjader's career, by my own admission, goes through some different eras. And his stuff at Verve is very commercially pop sensibility appealing. And I will even admit that it gets away from jazz for my definition. And that's part of what people don't get, is I'm just sharing how I define it, what jazz means to me. And to me, jazz has to be rooted in the blues very firmly. It's got to be about expressing how I feel. The second it becomes more soundscape and allows me to think about all the other things, it loses that personal connection, that communication with my soul. And it's still rooted in jazz. It just has different envelopes, different pockets where, and if we're going to say that jazz is primarily the avant-garde and that we're opening the door to all of that spectrum and all of that fusion rock, crossover R&B, if that's all jazz, there's no way even the most commercial Brubeck and Cal Tjader isn't jazz. These people who love the avant-garde won't hesitate to rip apart CTI. Oh, that's not jazz, it's elevator music. The elevator to heaven, and a lot of that Cecil Taylor shit, that's the elevator to hell. And if you think that's what jazz is about, that chaotic cacophony, there's no way that this isn't as well. And so partly why I've started down that road a year ago, trying to defend the bigger body of jazz, is because out of hand on these Facebook groups, I saw so many of the avant-garde people without any shame young collectors into buying the Modern Jazz Quartet, into buying the Three Sounds. It drove me nuts. The Three Sounds are one of the prime examples here. Cal Tjader, by the way, is a great piano player, a great drummer, as well as a vibraphone player and percussionist. He's really a fantastic. I think I have Three Sounds' first 4 records pulled. They have probably 20 on Blue Note during the classic period. And I've talked about Three Sounds plenty, but to me the Three Sounds, they sold well. And they're not that hard to find because of that. But because they'll go for $500 a pressing, well, the avant-garde people are like, oh, that's not jazz. It's a little too light for me, too cocktaily. And yet this has Ellington and Basie and the roots of the blues laced throughout it. Gene Harris is one of the great foundations of what jazz is to me. The guy never plays without a pocket. He never plays without feel. And I'm not sure there's a pianist that is better at telling you what's on his mind on a daily basis than Gene Harris. You know, it's just always this kind of the daily news. My opinion piece today is this. And he delicately extricates his personality and his what's on his mind in track after track after track. And my friend Jean-Michel Ries of Beethoven has kind of influenced me into getting his later stuff on Concord. And boy, does he ever become even a greater player in his later years. I'm a huge Gene Harris guy. And for you beginners out there, if you want a great place to start with jazz and you want to kind of dip your toe in, I think 3 Sounds or Gene Harris Spotify or Pandora station will be a fantastic doorway. I have like 5 Pandora stations that I go to, and one of them is Wynton Kelly, one of them is Gene Harris, one of them is Dexter Gordon, and that gives me more of the saxophone type stuff. There's certain great places that I can put on that ain't gonna really bother my kids or my wife, but I've been so busy lately with everything else. I've been listening to more stuff on Spotify than on vinyl, which I'm not thrilled with that arrangement ever. The MJQ, they have some great stuff early on Savoy. This is with Kenny Clark still is in the group. There's Kenny Clark right there. Kluk, I'm a big Kenny Clark guy. Milt Jackson's one of my favorite people in jazz. Percy Heath is great. And John Lewis, the pianist, is a very modern, compositionally driven player. And he takes elements of the classical vernacular, and he takes that classical vernacular and puts the blues behind it. And it's funny because most of these avant-garde fans cling to composition. They cling to abstract arrangements and complex composition. Yet, for a lot of them, modern jazz quartet is ridiculed. And because there's strings and there's classical pieces, the third stream, as it was called. Some of Chico Hamilton's work fits in that. Honestly, if you take some of the Gil Evans' work, it's very third stream. And yet we love Miles Davis with Sketches in Spain and all those classical elements, but with modern jazz quartet, oh, I see those records for $7, $8, $12, $15. It's got to be garbage. I didn't hear one horn going for 20 minutes. It can't be any good. And again, it's partly why I got that place where I had to defend and say, you know what, avant-garde, if anything, is not for everybody. It didn't sell well for a reason. It happens in the very tail end of jazz for a reason. It's very self-indulgent. It's ignoring its audience's experience oftentimes. And it's great if you like it. But don't bitch about me complaining about the avant-garde. And I actually like the avant-garde. I just don't think every jazz fan needs that love it to be a jazz fan. Which is certainly the message a lot of the avant-garde fans put out there. You'll be like, oh, that's garbage. You shouldn't be buying that. You should be buying this. Sun Ra all day long. Fuck MJQ. If you guys can take that stance, why do you have such a problem with me taking the opposite side of that argument? MJQ makes a lot of records. The early stuff at Savoy, some early stuff at Prestige, which is really solid. By this point, Connie Kay is in the group. And then they moved to Atlantic. And it's at Atlantic where they're really allowed to stretch their legs. And John Lewis is a great player who bridges the gap between classical European tradition and the blues really brilliantly. He's a brilliant musician. And he uses European artists at times to even further bridge that gap. And you can buy a lot of that Atlantic stuff for next to nothing. And for me, a lot of it at times has avant-garde elements to it. But because it's not the ugly, brittle, ear-piercing side of the avant-garde, they almost disregard it and think, oh, that's not avant-garde. That's not good composition. That's not jazz. Just don't get it. Ramee Lewis. He's another guy that, because of his commercial success, because of his appeal, because of how popular Ramee Lewis became, they're very dismissive of Ramee Lewis. And Ramee Lewis, along with Ahmad Jamal, keeps the Argo label afloat throughout the 60s and probably even into the 70s when it's Cadet. He's a very integral part of their success. And he has probably 30 records on Argo Cadet. And this is one of my favorite. I love the album cover right there down Chicago and Michigan Avenue. That these buildings are now surrounded by massive new modern skyscrapers, of course. But I love the city of Chicago. I love the city of New York. And it's funny how both those cities are so integral in the history of jazz. It takes a real deep well of humanity for an urban environment to push out what jazz is. That's just an important thing for us to kind of have a grasp of. This is, of course, The In Crowd by Ramee Lewis. And this was a pretty big crossover, jukebox, shuck and jive. You could hear this in a lot of blues bars and a lot of black neighborhood bars, and even in the white hipster bars. The In Crowd was a real crossover track, and I think sometimes, like Lee Morgan with Sidewinder, you become so attached to one element, one song, one crossover hit by an artist that, oh, you're like, I can't like him. He's that guy. And Ramee Lewis got his feet in the rhythm and blues of the black experience. He's so firmly a part of that establishment. And if you like Ray Charles, and if you like King Curtis and Louis Jordan, if you like those elements where jazz and rhythm and blues filaments are interwoven and two different braids kind of proceed, he's right there at that braiding point where it all kind of comes together, and what was the blues and what was urban jazz now is straightening out and becoming rhythm and blues, and Ramsey got it. But because he was successful, the avant-garde people got to be like, oh no. Another branch. You would think the avant-garde people, because of the complexity and composition and diversity of the avant-garde community, they'd be the first people to grasp new elements in the sound. Yet find me some avant-garde people who love the Bossa Nova. This was the last real stand jazz had, the Bossa Nova, commercially. 1962-63, jazz sold well and hit the charts for the last time. And there's moments where things will kind of, but on a broader scale, you as a record label had to have a Bossa Nova record in 1962. And it crossed over into every genre. Country labels were putting out Bossa Nova records. A sweeping sensation and one of jazz's last commercial gasps. And yet, it's something that the guys who love the avant-garde will be like, oh, Bossa Nova's not jazz. It's dishwater, you know? And they'll disparage it and have their snootiness towards it. And again, Jimmy Smith and even Grant Green, I've heard the avant-garde people talk about. And last but not least, Red Garland. He played with Miles. He's so rooted in the tradition of the blues and expressing the black experience. And I've even heard and read people taking shots at Red Garland. Oh, he's boring. Most of his records don't excite me. It's just the same thing. And I couldn't disagree with you more. I find Red Garland's records invigorating, full of experience and storytelling. And I just open up my soul and my ears, and I'm sitting on the old brother's knee, and he's telling me about the ways of the world. And so again, I think a lot of times the issue comes down to people in the avant-garde camp do too much listening and not enough feeling. If it's not complex and my ears aren't challenged by it, it's not jazz. And I'm going to go the other way. If it doesn't make me feel anything, especially not something that's got social relevance and speaks about the freedom of a people oppressed, that's not jazz. The compositional movements that happen in the 60s, it takes it away from that sense of feeling. And it doesn't make me feel or think about civil rights. It makes me think of a lot of different things. Often it sounds like the soundtrack to a space science fiction film. Some of that weird stuff. And again, feeling needs to be what drives us. Any artist wants you to tell them what the music makes you feel. What am I trying to get across? What am I expressing? So I'm just going to leave it at that. But I do think there's a great hypocrisy among a lot of those people. They just get indignant when I say anything about the avant-garde, and when I intimate that, you know what, it's not an essential part of the jazz canon. You can be a huge jazz fan and not have one squawking, honking horn anywhere. You don't need it. It's a small part. It's a small doorway that jazz walked through at the end of its life, and it left the old jazz world behind it. It went off on its own. And you can like 99% of the world of jazz, and the avant-garde's that 1%, you'll be just fine without it if you don't like it. If you like it, that's great. But if you're in that camp who likes that 1% of the music, if you continually take the pot shots and make newbies feel like they're not cool because, oh, I like this Brubeck. What do you mean? I can't like Brubeck? Fuck jazz then. And I just feel it's so counterproductive. And I feel like it's such a negative environment. And you even see these polls where someone would come to one of the new jazz groups on Facebook and be like, I'm new to jazz. What are some records I should look into grabbing? And I'm usually shocked by the things that end up in the top of the list. Shocked. And to me, it often just is saying, do you want no other people to buy this music? You know, the more people who buy it, the more stuff that will be in print and available for people to... And it's just, they want it to remain a little exclusive club. You know, I guess that's what it is. I don't know. But Brubeck is jazz. Cal Tjader is jazz. The Three Sounds, Jimmy Smith, it's jazz. And I've said it before, just because a record doesn't cost $300 doesn't mean it's not jazz. A lot of jazz was very commercial, very successful, and it ruled the continent, for the world really, for 40 years. So I'm going to leave it at that, like I said. Again, thank you for supporting me and my wife. It's very appreciated. There are a few new t-shirts now at the Jazz merchandise shop for the Jazz Vinyl Club and for the Jazz Shepherd himself. So check those shirts out if you want to help support the family in any way. Of course, you can go to Patreon if you want and pledge $5 a month or $10 a month there, just to help us, you know, build the channel and allow me to dedicate as much time to it as I want to. It was nice having the break, but it was a stressful week. And honestly, having this exchange is a great distraction for me in this crazy year. So it's partly why the content is heavy as it is. I'm sure there'll come a time where episodes become even more infrequent and the body of work can stand. People can catch up and watch all of it. But for now, as long as there's lockdowns and people sitting in their home looking for someone to talk to and something to watch, I'm going to try to provide as much great content as I can. So keep us in your thoughts and prayers. The wife's still on quarantine, so I got to wait for her to go walk the dog so I can edit this and put this video out. But it should come out sometime later today, Sunday. So y'all be safe. Take care out there. You know, be smart. And most of all, shed love. Share love. Spread the love. Not just of jazz, but of each other. Tolerance. Let's find the beauty in each other. There's far more we have in common than we are different. And if we can see what's beautiful about each other, those differences will shine. And there's no need to be afraid of each other. Everybody just wants their kids home safe at night and food in their kids' stomachs. And if you get in the way of that, you can make me your enemy. But if you're not getting in the way of me feeding my kids and my kids being home safe tonight, I don't care how you pray. I don't care what color you are and what flag you want to hang in your pole. And socialism, a stable middle class provides that. And that's the last comment I want to make, is that a lot of people's politics goes as far as their own personal beliefs. And if I'm only concerned about my interests, it allows some of the greed policies to make more sense. When we start thinking about what's in the best interest of everybody, I don't know how capitalism functions in that. I just don't see it. It at best can elevate one country high above everyone else. But I'm not going to talk any more about that because it's not just the point. Y'all be safe. Peace.